One time a couple years back, on a dark, rainy day in Hong Kong, when I was a beginner at film photography, I shot my first roll of Ektachrome100. I made a couple of mistakes shooting this film, but those mistakes also turned into what I would call happy accidents that taught me a lot about not just film, but photography and exposure and light in general. So in this video, I'm just going to talk about that experience and look back at those photos and what I learned. So a couple of years ago in Hong Kong, when it was a very rainy, overcast day, I shot one roll of Kodak Ektachrome100 and the results turned out really nice in my opinion. And just for one personal reason why I really love the way out this roll of film turned out is because I almost lost it. Because there was some mistake I made when unloading the film. The film did not end up inside of the canister, but instead it just kind of ended up on the other side of the film camera. I don't know how I did this because, to be honest, I'm kind of a noob when it comes to film photography. If somebody knows what I actually did wrong, I'd love to hear about it. But anyway, when I opened the film camera, I was shocked to learn that the film was just inside of the camera, exposed. So I quickly closed it, and then I messaged the lab on WhatsApp asking if this can be salvaged. Luckily, they managed to salvage this roll of film. I had to wait like 3 weeks and pay some extra, but I'm glad I went through that and I didn't just throw away the entire roll. Like, my first reaction was just to throw the whole thing away because I didn't really think the photos were going to be anything good, and I was kind of mad at myself. And I'll explain exactly why when we review the photos in a second. So when I got the film roll back from the lab, or rather the scans, I only got about 28 photos because a couple of the first shots had been destroyed by the light leaking into them, and signs of that are apparent in the couple first photos as well. Luckily, the first few shots that I shot on this film were not important, they were just basic snapshots. So before this, I had been toying with the idea of trying to shoot a rainy day underexposed. I had no idea how it would look on this film in particular. I just wanted to try it, because if you're someone who knows me, you might know that I don't really like to shoot during daytime. But I was kind of trying to reverse engineer why I don't like shooting in the daytime. And I figured the reason I didn't really like shooting in the daytime is because daytime is too bright and I just really like darkness in photos. So then I started thinking, like, how can I achieve that look during the daytime? Well, it's just a matter of underexposing those photos, and all of a sudden daytime can look like kind of pseudo nighttime. The other difference between daytime and nighttime is during nighttime, especially in cities, there's going to be a lot more artificial light. So I started looking for these artificial neon lights and sometimes car backlights, and any light source that was artificial that would show up even if it was underexposed. And that's the logic I was using to compose these photos. Now at the time I had no idea what kind of a film Ektachrome was. I had no idea what film did in general, but later I realized it is what you call a slide film, and to be honest, I have no idea what that actually means. But a quality of this film is that if you shoot it underexposed, you get a lot of contrast. The shadows are going to be crushed quite heavily, as you can see on these photos, and the colors are going to be quite harsh and contrasty. But it turns out that is a really good combination with the location that I was shooting. I think the successful photos out of this roll work really well with this kind of underexposure of about, what I would remember is about 1 stop. Now unfortunately I did not mark down the exposure because I was too busy with learning how to actually operate my new film camera, so I can only guess what the exposure was after the fact, but I do believe I tried to underexpose by about 0.75 to 1 stops of light. The camera I was using, by the way, is the Canon AE1 and the 50mm f1.8, so a very basic and common setup. But I was still new to this camera, so it took me a while to trust it and learn how to focus with it and get comfortable with it. Not all of the shots were successful, obviously. With this you gotta be really careful not to underexpose too much, because it is impossible to rescue these photos if they are underexposed. But the few photos that came out just right on the limit between underexposure but not being too bright, I really like the way the tones and the colors look in them. The way of dread and darkness that comes across in these photos is something that I've started to emulate with my digital edits during the daytime as well. I don't mind the shadows being crushed, and I don't mind the low dynamic range. I think in the beginning, when we're starting out, we're always obsessed with trying to get the HDR photos, trying to get as much dynamic range out of them as possible. But after a couple years of shooting, I realized that sometimes what is exactly the opposite of HDR, what I would call low dynamic range or LDR, is actually a very desired effect sometimes. And I think the reason that is because it creates these photos that are a lot more minimalistic. They have silhouettes and deep shadows and a sense of darkness that actually makes the photos seem a lot more simple, a lot more minimal, a lot just artistic in general. And also I quite like the grain. When we first start photography, we're usually obsessed with getting the cleanest possible photos, but the grain of the film photos is really attractive, and in fact I've started to intentionally add grain to my digital photos as well occasionally, simply because I just like the way that it looks these days, and I draw a lot of inspiration for my edits from film. Actually, I haven't been shooting that much film recently because I travel a lot, even especially before COVID, and I simply had to give up something, so I gave up my film camera. But I'm really looking forward to starting film photography again, because it does teach you a lot about photography and it's really fun to experiment with these kind of things. Now, one thing about Ektachrome that I learned later is that it really doesn't look too good on a sunny day, at least in my opinion. One quality of Ektachrome is that it kind of gives you this very cold white balance, and I found that shooting this on a regular day with no rain, no overcast, just doesn't really work. And even when it was a rainy day, but not that dark, so just a drizzle, the photos don't really have the same effect. So it really requires the kind of overcast darkness to bring out this style. As you can see, they don't really have the same type of darkness in them, and it's because it's not raining as hard, there's not as many clouds, it's just not as dark. And I'm perhaps not underexposing it as much as I was earlier, and it's not as easy to edit these the same way either. Now, one thing about shooting Ektachrome in the dark is that it's really difficult, because now you cannot underexpose them. Now you have to basically overexpose them, and it's an ISO 100 rated film, so that's really difficult if you're not pushing it. Back then I never even knew what pushing was, so I never properly got to try this film in the dark. On this roll that I shot later in Japan, I shot during the sunset and the blue hour, so the white balance is very blue without having to edit that kind of thing. But when it gets too dark, my shutter speed is just too slow, and you can see a lot of motion blur, and those photos were not really unusable because they were either underexposed or just blurry. But the way the colors and the tones come out of this film has been really interesting, and as I said, I've been really inspired by the way the colors came out, especially in the first shoot with this film, that I've used it a lot as an inspiration for my digital photography and editing. And that is why I really recommend everyone to shoot film. Even if you're not gonna become like a permanent hipster, you can learn a lot about how light functions and how film works and how exposure works, and you can accidentally learn a lot of things, and honestly it's just quite fun. Thank you very much for watching this video. Let me know in the comments if you shot film and have had experiences like this where the results were unpredictable and surprising and you learned something. I would love to hear what is your favorite kind of film for this kind of happy accidents. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, make sure you do subscribe. I'm trying to make at least one video every week from now on until the end of time. So do subscribe so you don't miss out on those videos. And press the like button. And I hope to see you in the next video. Jesus, I'm so bad at talking today.